Brooklyn and Ethan have been in a relationship since their college days. Back then, Brooklyn was being courted by two young men, Ethan and his comrade Mason. Both claimed Brooklyn's love, but in the end she chose Ethan. He was more serious and hardworking, while Mason was charismatic, but lacked a serious mindset. As time went on, Brooklyn began to think about their future together and wanted a serious relationship. Their relationship grew quickly, and they were safely married. Recently, their daughter Paisley celebrated her 7th birthday. For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed calm. However, as time went on, Brooklyn began to criticize her husband more often. She constantly compared him to the husbands of her acquaintances, who have not yet found a family. Brooklyn was tired of hearing about how these husbands overwhelmed their wives with gifts, often took them on vacations, and lived more interesting lives. Brooklyn felt that her own life lacked thrills. It revolved around work, managing their small apartment, and taking care of the baby. Work seemed routine and monotonous to her. One day, she started nagging her husband again about not advancing in his career. She compared him to the husbands of her friends who had started successful businesses and were making good money. Brooklyn's constant complaints drove Ethan to the brink, and that night their discontent escalated into a major fight. A few days later, Ethan was at work when he was interrupted by a call from his university friend Mason. They hadn't talked much, but Mason was cheerful and asked how Ethan was doing. After a brief conversation, Mason explained the reason for his call. He was inviting Ethan and his wife Brooklyn to his birthday party the following Friday. He promised a fantastic party with lots of guests and fun, urging them not to miss the event. Ethan readily accepted the invitation, already imagining how he would spend the evening with his wife. They rarely went out together, and he hoped it would be a nice respite for Brooklyn, who had been a little cranky lately. When Ethan had shared the exciting news with Brooklyn, she had, to his surprise, set aside her negativity and happily agreed to come. He was relieved, deciding that this outing was just what she needed. Friday night, they arranged for their daughter Paisley to stay with her grandparents and went to Mason's. The apartment was spacious with a modern design, and the living room was filled with guests enjoying the party. Among them were some familiar faces from their college days. As the evening progressed, everyone congratulated Mason and inquired about his progress at work, noting that things were going well for him. Ethan mingled with the guests, and Brooklyn seemed particularly enamored with their host. She watched him closely, noting how successful and contented he had become since their college days. The alcohol flowed, the guests arrived one after another, and soon the husband felt quite depressed, as he was not used to drinking so much. To avoid embarrassment, he retired to another room and lay down on the sofa to rest. The party went on. Brooklyn chatted gracefully with her classmates. One of them was telling her about his life, making Brooklyn wonder about their past together. "I still can't understand why things didn't work out between us back then," she pondered, casting him a meaningful glance. Feeling the effects of the alcohol, Mason took her words quite literally. Without thinking, he stealthily led her to his bedroom. Old feelings resurfaced as they began to kiss, and his wife did not feel the slightest sense of guilt or hesitation at that moment. In her mind, she was already living the life that the man had so beautifully painted. To the noise of the party guests in the next room, it all happened in an instant. Brooklyn had just cheated on her husband for the first time, and even with his friend. Later, the husband was awakened by the loud laughter of the guests. Glancing at the time, he decided it was time to leave. Entering the living room, he saw that his wife was sitting with a glass in her hand, immersed in her thoughts. Distracted by his own sleepiness and head sick from alcohol, the husband said goodbye to the party, caught a cab, and went home. He fell into a deep sleep as soon as his head touched the pillow, and his wife lingered in the kitchen before going to bed. About a month had passed since this incident. Gradually, the wife began to communicate less frequently with her husband, often leaving to see her friends and behaving strangely. When the tense atmosphere in the house became unbearable, The husband finally plucked up the courage to talk to her and was met with unexpected news. The wife exploded and started spewing out all her accumulated resentments. She began by complaining about her standard of living, then about domestic problems, and finally confessed that she was no longer attracted to him as a man. The husband jokingly asked, "Then who are you attracted to?" To his surprise, the wife seriously replied, "Mason." After such a revelation, it was no longer possible to remain silent. The wife expressed her dissatisfaction with her life with Ethan and said that with Mason, a completely different life awaited her. So she announced her decision to leave him and be with her new love. Since their daughter was already asleep, her husband was careful not to raise his voice when discussing the baby. When he asked about the daughter, the wife simply said, "We'll decide that later," and went to pack her things. The husband, trying to have a heart-to-heart talk, turned to his friend, now ex. However, his attempts were ignored. Ethan initiated divorce proceedings, and in all this time, the wife only visited their child once. It was obvious that her heart was not in the right place, as she quickly returned to her lover. She didn't even request custody of her own child. Perhaps Mason wasn't burning to become a father, or perhaps her husband didn't want his daughter to grow up with a stranger. He ended up living alone with their daughter Paisley. All her questions about her mother's whereabouts were difficult to answer, but eventually she figured it out on her own. Brooklyn clung tightly to her new life and found happiness with her lover. However, this happiness did not last long. Mason proved to be incompatible with married life, as he still wanted carefree fun and freedom from commitment. Brooklyn began comparing him to her ex-husband Ethan and realized that he wasn't as bad as she had previously assumed. After 6 months, Brooklyn ended her relationship with Mason and began looking for reasons to see her ex-husband. During every meeting with their daughter, she subtly tried to elicit sympathy by saying phrases like, "Maybe we should go out and ask your dad. Let's have dinner together," and so on. One day, when their daughter ran off to her room and the ex-spouses were alone, Ethan firmly told Brooklyn that she should no longer interfere in his life. He explained, "Please see your daughter, but don't ruin our lives or create unnecessary stress." In pursuit of fleeting life changes, Brooklyn left her family and plunged into a passionate, yet fledgling relationship. However, such unstable unions usually fall apart quickly, and it is often impossible to regain the trust of abandoned loved ones. In the end, everyone gets exactly what they deserve.